The middle class are just like pigs. The older they get, the dumber they get. The middle class are just like pigs. The fatter they get, the less they regret. These words, written in 1962 by Belgian songwriter Jacques Brel and translated in the late 60s by Eric Blau and Mort Schumann, are fascinating because they present a picture of the middle class that's probably foreign to most Americans. No pun intended. When Americans hear middle class, they usually get a picture of someone who's neither particularly wealthy nor very poor. Poll after survey after study show that the overwhelming majority of Americans consider themselves to be middle class. But that's not how it used to be. Historically, the middle class were pretty well off. The bourgeoisie, not the proletariat. This changed in the last century, and the meaning of the term middle class morphed into something that nobody quite knows how to define. If we don't understand what the middle class is and how it got to be whatever it is, how can we deliver policies and messaging that will help the middle class? How can we expand the middle class so that more people can participate in the American dream? The history of the middle class is the topic for this episode of Progressive Solutions. As always, I welcome your comments. How do you define middle class, and what do you think we should do to strengthen it? And if you like this video, hit that thumbs up button below, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell so that you can be notified of future videos when they come out. There are a lot of progressive solutions. Even back in ancient times, there was nobility. Royalty, major landowners, even many religious leaders all belonged in this category. In the Western world, the categories pretty much remained the same until very recently. Then there were the peasants. They worked on land they usually didn't own, or maybe owned a small plot, barely enough to feed their family. Some were craftsmen, and today's version of the peasant might work in a retail store or a fast food joint, earning barely enough to get by. The nobility were a very small group, but they're almost exclusively the ones who get into the history books. Generals, too, usually came from the nobility. And the peasants? They were almost all of the rest of the people. So what was left? Well, basically it was merchants, traders, a smattering of professionals like doctors or teachers. In a wealthy society where the farms produced plenty of food or where trade was thriving, this middle class between the nobility and the peasantry could be significant. But it was never a majority, or even close. To give you an idea, most leaders of the French Revolution came from their middle class. Danton was a lawyer and the son of a lawyer. Robespierre was also a lawyer and the son and grandson of lawyers. Marat was the only leader among the three who didn't come from a middle class, that is to say, professional family, but he rose to become a doctor and an essayist. And the American Revolution, who were our founders? Well, Thomas Jefferson was a farmer, meaning he owned slaves who did the farming on the 5,000 acres of land he inherited while he studied to become a lawyer. John Adams was also a farmer, meaning he inherited his family farm and spent most of his time as a lawyer as well. George Washington, another farmer who inherited his property and had slaves to run it, while he went off and became a surveyor and a military officer. The list goes on and on. Paul Revere was a craftsman. John Hancock inherited his uncle's import-export business. Gouverneur Morris was born to wealthy landowners and went straight into politics. Alexander Hamilton, well, he was the exception. He was born a bastard on a Caribbean island, but he worked his way up out of poverty. The point is, most of our founders considered themselves to be middle class, and many were by the standard of the time. Today, however, we would consider them to be coming mostly from the upper classes. America didn't have an official nobility, and even the wealthiest American colonists weren't that wealthy when compared to the British elite, but most of our founders were quite well off, even by the British standard of the day. The 19th century saw a dramatic shift in the class structure. In America, there were three major causes: the end of slavery, the Industrial Revolution, and mass immigration. The effects of the end of slavery were slowed by a century of segregation, but the effects of the Industrial Revolution were swift and stark. And the Industrial Revolution, combined with a renewed westward expansion after the end of slavery, well, that led to the first major waves of immigration. So, lots of new factories, lots of new immigrants, lots of newly freed slaves, all this added up to a burgeoning peasant class, or working class as they've come to be known. Even on the expanding western frontier, a lot of farms and especially mines started cropping up, creating even more opportunities for working class people. But the middle class mostly dwindled. Growing industry and growing transportation and communication, made possible by the inventions of the railroad and the telegraph, made the 19th century the age of the tycoon. Meanwhile, the population of the U.S. grew even faster. It doubled between 1810 and 1840, doubled again by 1870, and doubled yet again by 1900. And the overwhelming majority of the new people were stuck in that peasant or working class as factory laborers or household servants. With the rise of the tycoon, a tiny portion of the population, and a fast-growing working class, the vast majority of the population, the middle class was pretty much ignored. They existed, such as they did, primarily to serve the tycoons, large and small. But the rise of the industrialist tycoon also saw the rise of the labor movement. Although, interestingly, the first workers' strike in the U.S. occurred before there was a U.S., in 1768. The first trade union was formed in 1794 in Philadelphia. Throughout the 19th century, trade unions and labor organizations fought for better pay, fought for better working conditions, and occasionally fought each other. Meanwhile, the tycoons fought back, sometimes hiring strikebreakers, sometimes bribing or coercing police forces into attacking labor organizers, and lobbying for anti-union legislation. It took a long time, but by the end of World War II, the trade unions were generally winning, and this had a fascinating effect. For the first time ever, ordinary laborers could earn enough to be considered middle class. They could live in nice houses in the suburbs, they could take family vacations, and they could not only meet their needs, but even afford a few luxuries in a fairly stable way. In the 1970s, however, corporations, the new tycoons, started to fight back. Generally, the credit or blame for the rise of corporate conservatism and political activism is given to the so-called Powell memo. This was a confidential memo written by Lewis Powell, who would be appointed by President Nixon to the Supreme Court just a couple of months later, for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Among other things, Powell had been on the board of Philip Morris, where he claimed that news reports talking about the dangers of tobacco infringed on his company's First Amendment rights. He also despised consumer advocate Ralph Nader. Powell's corporate advocacy led to the 1978 Supreme Court decision that allowed corporations to donate directly to ballot issue campaigns, and that led, eventually, to the infamous Citizens United decision. In his 1971 memo, Powell advocated for the massive purge of what he called left-wing elements. His memo jump-started the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's direct involvement in right-wing political activism. It provides both the ideology and much of the language for the current right-wing extremism. With big business getting more involved in politics and spending ever-increasing amounts on political campaigns, media campaigns, and judicial pressures, the tide began to turn against unions. By 1981, even the Democratic Party had abandoned labor. For more on this, see my video on the Democratic Party's history with progressivism. It's linked up here and also in the description below. The Democratic Party's abandonment of labor gave President Reagan the political cover he needed to fire the striking air traffic workers in 1981 and decertify their union, PATCO. After that, attacks on the new middle class increased. The minimum wage came under attack, and right now it's 27% below where it was in 1981 after adjusting for inflation. In addition, union membership has been cut in half in the 35 years between 1983 and 2018. Other factors also played a part. The advent of the cargo container ship made it a lot cheaper to manufacture goods overseas. Manufacturing used to account for 16% of U.S. GDP. That was in 1997. Today, it's just 11%. In addition, 60 years of automation has taken over a lot of the manufacturing processes and cut a lot of good-paying union jobs. Since the late 1960s, manufacturing jobs as a percentage of the total U.S. workforce have been cut by 2/3. The new middle class of the 20th century, it's all but been eliminated. In its place, we see tens of millions of low-wage and often part-time jobs in the retail and service sectors. Since so many of these new jobs are part-time, A lot of people have to hold down two jobs just to pay the bills, and even those two jobs still pay less than a single full-time job paid just 40 years ago. In addition, workers with two jobs have to juggle two schedules, often rushing from one job to the other. Free time has diminished and stress levels have increased. Meanwhile, we've seen the rise of the new business tycoons. There are now just over 600 billionaires in the US, and the top 400 of them, they have almost as much wealth as the bottom two-thirds of the country. And the middle class? That's being hollowed out. Although, based on classical definitions, the US still does have a larger middle class than existed throughout much of history. Just over one-third of U.S. households had an income of between $75,000 and $200,000 in 2019. But that's down from closer to 45%, inflation adjusted, just 40 years ago. On the other hand, over half of Americans are living below that level, while 40 years ago, that number was just one-fourth. It seems that for one brief shining period in history, the middle class was truly large and growing. Those days are in the past. But can they return? Yes, they can. There's plenty of wealth in this country. It's just been concentrated in very few hands as it was in the days of centuries and millennia past. But we can reverse those trends again, and we can introduce new systems to regrow the middle class. It won't be easy. As Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. After 50 years of right-wing propaganda, people have become accustomed to a system that distributes wealth more and more unevenly. Oddly, the real hope for change lies in the surprisingly massive support for Donald Trump. Trump played on people's unease with current trends and on the Democratic Party's utter failure to attack them head-on. His proposals were hideously wrong, of course, and just make things worse. But if a political party were to support a seriously progressive agenda, people would respond favorably. And we could rebuild and strengthen the middle class. So what do you think? How can we rebuild the middle class? Where would you start? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. Stay progressive.